After what could be described as one of the most interesting years in the fighting game community, 2017 not only delivered great moments, but featured a sense of changing of the guard, so to speak. And the road that the FGC is on in 2018 only further confirms that same perception. Before we get to the list, I do want to preface by saying that games mentioned in last year's State of the FGC that are no longer headliner games will be excluded from this list, even though I still consider them an important part of the FGC. As I mentioned in 2017, I believe that Tekken 7 had the potential to be the most important game on last year's list, and looking back, I still stand by that statement. Considering I spoke about Tekken 7's technical depth ad nauseum on many occasions, there's no need for me to continue to praise the game. As it is the case with many of the legacy games on this list, the games are what they are, and as of 2018, we know that Tekken 7 is exceptional. The game's proven quality not only showcased itself with critical reviews, online metrics, and global player numbers, but also as an enjoyable spectating experience noted by both professional and casual gameplay. And overall, the word on Tekken around the community is predominantly a good one. The few additions that can be mentioned is the implementation of guest characters from various different franchises, and while opinions of the guest characters vary depending on the person, the conceptual idea is an interesting one. However, the true revelation we discovered regarding Tekken 7 in 2018 is that Bandai Namco's attentiveness is something we should not take for granted, and while as Tekken community members we tend to make light of the developer of the game, Bandai Namco, led by leading game producer Katsuhiro Harada, has truly stayed on task when it came to delivering a continuous, satisfying experience, exemplified by things like the Tekken World Tour, constant arcade-to-console updates, etc. Lastly, and this is not to say that the Tekken team is flawless, but its proven track record of both communicating and solving its community's concern is one of the many aspects that makes Tekken 7 a fan favorite in 2018. It would be safe to say that prior to its release, no one foresaw Dragon Ball FighterZ becoming the juggernaut presence in the FGC that it has turned into. While there was a good reason to believe that the game would be popular, the game certainly eclipsed its initial goal. Visually, as it pertains to any licensed adaptation in a video game, Dragon Ball FighterZ's uncanny graphical achievement is truly one to be applauded. Character models, voice acting, source material references, and all of the little things in between. When it comes to its presentation, Dragon Ball FighterZ absolutely hit it out of the park. Mechanically, as true for nearly every Arc System Works game, Dragon Ball FighterZ is responsive, well-adjusted, and creative. The 3-on-3 aspect of the game is one we don't see very often, if ever, in anime games, especially not when mechanics like assist, key charge, and other game-specific options. The final word on Dragon Ball FighterZ is not nearly close to being uttered. However, the only true concern the game has had in its infancy stage is its unclear meta. The game's technical depth is an interesting one, as it seems to plateau fairly early, with strategy heavily prioritizing chaotic offense and somewhat of a familiar playstyle for most of the cast with a reliance of team chemistry and assists. However, despite it being technically less demanding than what we normally expect from the makers of the Guilty Gear franchise, Dragon Ball FighterZ still has room to shape its meta in the future, with the ability to perhaps play the game differently than its current default erratic pace, yet oddly slow round closing buildup, but more importantly, an ability to showcase a skill gap between veterans and newcomers, as currently that gap simply is somewhat lost in the shuffle. In conclusion, it's not for everyone, but if there's a game that's close to that, it has to be Dragon Ball FighterZ, as it has demonstrated to reach audiences of many different communities. The present is looking pretty good for Dragon Ball FighterZ, and while I believe there's room for improvement, I don't see it having a future that's any less favorable.
Cross-system activation confirmed.
Blaze Blue! Cross-tag battle!
It is less than a week old, therefore judging BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle at this point in time would hardly be of any use, as the game is nowhere near the polished product it will most likely be months down the road. However, speaking towards the innovation of BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle is still very much possible. The 2-on-2 mechanic the game uses in many aspects was a risk to take. However, as it currently stands, Arc System Works seemingly was able to implement what would be a fast-paced style while still maintaining the integrity of the meta that we are used to in games like Persona 4 Arena, Under Night and Birth, and the traditional BlazBlue. While it might not be able to appeal to the masses like Dragon Ball FighterZ has, the use of a license like Ruby is certainly an interesting one, and as of right now, the experiment seems to be a favorable one. It is yet to be seen, however, the biggest potential BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle has is not only demonstrating how a true tag anime game balances simplification without sacrificing its middle ground, but also is a good testbed for potentially paving the way for other well-liked licenses to spin off, or even reopening one door especially, a new standalone Persona Arena fighting game. Even though we have some ideas, it's way too early to speculate anything good or bad about Soul Calibur 6, especially since its delay announcement earlier this year. However, what we do know about Soul Calibur 6 is that it's brought to you by the makers of Tekken 7 and the publishers of Dragon Ball FighterZ, which bodes well for the game's quality. Whether the game turns out to be as highly touted as the two aforementioned is to be discovered, but at this point in time, Bandai Namco has proven itself as being first-rate, and has shown us no reason recently to not trust the direction they have in mind for their games. Lastly, despite its early showing and possible system changes, Soul Calibur 6 looks promising enough when taking in its graphical fidelity, art direction, early roster choices, and somewhat inspired gameplay mechanics seen in Tekken 7. And although it's modernizing itself, the game is still holding on to its traditional mechanics, maintaining its franchise's integrity. When trying to compare Street Fighter V's position this year compared to last year, it's tough to say that much has changed than what has already been established, perhaps even since the game's release. Capcom's narrative has been one of constant faltering, regaining balance, only to falter again. With that said, the release of Street Fighter V Arcade Edition was very much a step in the right direction, but even its mere conception is proof that Street Fighter V didn't turn out as originally planned. Though, to its credit, Street Fighter V Arcade Edition opened up the game with more mechanical additions, characters, and much improved overall content and UI changes. It could be said that Street Fighter V Arcade Edition at this point in time is perhaps what the FGC initially expected, content-wise, back during the game's launch. And though we had to wait a little over 2 years for it to happen, late is always better than never. However, despite the mechanical and presentation changes made to Street Fighter V with its Arcade Edition update, the game and everything it encompasses, be it technicality, meta, etc., is already too far along to completely shift to something different. Personally speaking, I believe Street Fighter V Arcade Edition is a comprehensive fighting game experience. However, while it's unfortunate, its past faltering still haunts it, and the shadow of its legacy is seemingly one that is growing out of reach. Whether the game is good or not is subjective on the individual. Street Fighter V Arcade Edition is what it is in 2018, and although it might not be ideal, perhaps that's not a bad position to be in. Despite it being derived from somewhat of an unfortunate circumstance, in 2018 it finally feels as if the pressure of carrying the FGC is no longer solely on Street Fighter's shoulders to bear. As seen with the successful campaigns of Dragon Ball FighterZ and Tekken 7 had experienced in their freshman year, Street Fighter V Arcade Edition, while still having an important role, has seemingly become a part of the pack, rather than the one forced to lead it. Considering it started as a passion project and turned into a full-fledged game upon initial exposure, it's tough to gauge how to feel about the upcoming Fighting EX layer. It's certainly a feel-good story when considering the trials its developer had to go through, however, there are concerns regarding the game. Looking on the bright side, Fighting EX layer does offer a style and mechanical aspects that aren't currently of any part of the main stage fighting games in 2018. The game incorporates mechanics from games such as Street Fighter EX, Fighting Layer, and most recently Street Fighter Cross Tekken, which already speaks to its uniqueness. Although there is a bit of obscurity with regards to the license, as the characters involved aren't too well known unless you're part of the hardcore FGC, perhaps Fighting EX Layer's biggest hurdle may be the fact that the combination of relying on nostalgia to go along with only releasing on one platform may severely hurt the game's ability to reach a wider audience, even if its core gameplay turns out to be of quality. Despite it perhaps no longer being a headlining game at most tournaments in 2018, as well as being highlighted in last year's State of the FGC, King of Fighters 14's quality is too good to simply go unnoticed, and that aspect alone secures its spot on this year's list. Similar to Street Fighter V's case, it's tough to say that King of Fighters 14's position changed much compared to last year, but it didn't necessarily need to. We know what King of Fighters 14 brings to the table. It's a legacy fighting game catered to somewhat the hardcore portion of the FGC, and it's backed by a top-notch developer. It's definitely not for everyone, evident by it getting lost in the shuffle, but with everything that comes along with the ride that is King of Fighters 14, with regards to its storied legacy characters, its emphasis on technical gameplay, a small yet inviting community, and SNK being a premier fighting game developer, King of Fighters 14 is superb. As an anime fighting game that somewhat goes against the grain by setting a traditional 2D pace, while still embracing the freedom of movement and creative mechanics seen in up-tempo anime fighters, Under Night in Birth EXE Late Test, more commonly referred to as UNIL ST, certainly separates itself from the pack. However, while separating from the pack is well and good with regards to maintaining a unique system, where it's also separated from the pack is with its unfortunate console exclusivity, hurting the game's overall appeal, not due to quality, but simple incapability of reaching a wider audience. The few new mechanic implementations and characters added to the game without a doubt helped open up options, which was something necessary for the game's previous iterations, and its overall balance finally seemed to reach a good point. However, until it opens up to more platforms, the game's potential, while not wasted, is certainly not being maximized.
Xrd, Rev 2.
Although Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 is only in its sophomore year, Guilty Gear Xrd has been around for a while, and despite Arc System Works' busy 2018, I still maintain, as I did last year when I featured the game on this list, Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 is the best offering that anime has for the FGC. It's technical, accessible for any type of player, polished with all of the standards and more, and even left room for some bells and whistles. In a similar predicament that King of Fighters 14 is in, if Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 doesn't have you sold now, it's really you who's missing out. We don't know how long this iteration of Guilty Gear is going to stick around, but the run it has had so far has been nothing short of exceptional. However long its community continues to support the game is as long as I see it sitting on the throne of all anime fighting games. Injustice 2 was only about a week old when it was referenced on last year's list, and while changes were made to the game, its impact has been somewhat unnoticed if not part of the hardcore NRS community. Similar to many other NetherRealm Studio games, the meta of Injustice 2 is somewhat understood by veteran players. The game emphasizes a heavy mix-up of high-lows, chip damage, some stage awareness, and even a few gimmicks. However, putting aside a less than favorable DLC model and some graphical inconsistencies, Injustice 2 actually is one of the most accessible games for both veterans and beginners out on the current market. Though Injustice 2, like many previous NRS games, just simply is unable to captivate the mainstream fighting game community for longer than the initial honeymoon period. It's unfortunate, but the thing that makes NRS games so unique, Injustice 2 included, is also the probable cause for deterring some players from sticking with it. Injustice 2 is somewhat between a rock and a hard place, because it's not trying to be like anything else out there. However, it's also in the weird space of being both a traditional 2D game with 3D mechanics. Though, considering its hardcore audience is overall happy with it, perhaps widening the game's horizon is not something all that necessary. I don't know that I can think of a sadder narrative in the FGC when it comes to a legacy title, especially brought to you by a developer who helms the most recognizable name in fighting games. There's no sugarcoating it. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite is on life support, and it hasn't even reached a year of being out. If there was a worst case scenario for MVCI, it's this one, evident by the game not even being able to secure a main stage spot at EVO 2018. To make matters worse, Capcom has seemingly abandoned the game, with rare, if any sort of communication with its player base, and no real future plans to further support the game. Taking aside its graphical woes, roster decisions, and online functionality, MVCI at its core is still a pretty decent Marvel game considering its technical side. It might not be what some expected, but considering everything it has been criticized for, its gameplay shouldn't be on that list. At this point in time, it's unlikely to see how Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite makes a resurgence. It's currently only staying afloat due to its hardcore community, and there is no reason to believe Capcom is going to come to its rescue anytime soon. A truly unfortunate case, however, MVCI's initial impression and negative outlook was seemingly too detrimental for the game to overcome. BlazBlue Central Fiction is no longer a main stage game, however, not because it can't hold its own, as the franchise has proven time and time again to deliver when the lights shine at their brightest. However, considering the release of BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, a sacrifice unfortunately has to be made, and as I don't see Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 losing its spot, BlazBlue Central Fiction's last year of highlighted relevancy is most likely 2018. It's to be determined what the future looks like for another standalone BlazBlue game, as Arc System Works has their hand in a lot of projects regarding the fighting game landscape, which means it might take a little longer until BlazBlue returns to form as a standalone title. However, excluding BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle's reception, the latest memory fighting game fans will have of BlazBlue should be a favorable one, as personally, I have BlazBlue Central Fiction only second to Guilty Gear Xrd Revelator 2 when it comes to the best anime titles currently available. We don't know much of anything when it comes to Dead or Alive 6, so its position in 2018 is irrelevant considering it's not even scheduled to be out until early 2019. However, the one thing that is somewhat eye-catching with regards to the initial reveal trailer of the game is its possible hint at a complete thematic shift. The Dead or Alive series for a long time has been somewhat dismissed by the FGC and considered as a joke, mostly due to the fact that the technical portion of the games in the series were overshadowed by fan service, unappealing spin-offs, etc. However, if Dead or Alive 6 is in an attempt to rededicate the franchise to becoming a serious player in the 3D landscape, that's exciting news for the FGC. If I'm completely honest, I don't believe SNK Heroines Tag Team Frenzy belongs on this list, mainly because I don't factor it as a proper fighting game title. However, considering its developer is a respected one in SNK and it does make use of King of Fighters characters, the least I could do was give it the benefit of doubt. While I don't see the game becoming a player in the FGC upon its release, as it seems to be targeting a more casual audience with perhaps the hope of bringing them over to the King of Fighters games, I don't necessarily hate the idea of the game, as I almost see it as a spin-off that has potential to open the door to a wider audience. Time will tell what the impact of the game will have on the FGC, however, considering SNK made it clear out of the gate with the direction they had for the game, whether it accomplishes its potential goal of increasing the King of Fighter player base, or simply just becomes a standalone casual experience, there really isn't a negative outcome as it pertains to the fighting game community. Last year, I said that 2017 was a transitional year for the fighting game community, and while it had potential for some growth with some upcoming titles such as Tekken 7, there was no real way of knowing which direction the FGC was going to lean towards, considering Street Fighter V's position and the traditional thinking of how the FGC only goes as far as Street Fighter does. However, if 2017 was the year to introduce and build a foundation for the fighting game community's new direction, 2018 is taking that new direction and running full steam ahead to a future I'm not sure anyone had in mind. I've previously mentioned that the FGC and Capcom were at a crossroads, and it was only a matter of time until a road was picked by either side. Well, the choice was finally made. 2018 is shaping up to be a year that is no longer focused on what Capcom and Street Fighter is doing, but rather what moves the FGC as a whole is making. The emergence of Bandai Namco and Arc System Works especially have seemingly turned the tide, as the two have taken a significant portion of the mindshare within the fighting game community. In closing, while it might have happened a little sooner than initially anticipated, the new look for the fighting game community is going to be one to watch, as I believe 2018 has become the year where the FGC no longer has to look for Street Fighter to carry the burden of leading the way, but rather it's a combined effort of multiple games, each playing a significant part. It's to be determined if this new look for the FGC is sustainable. However, if the first half of 2018 is any indication, I personally remain optimistic that if there's a community that can pull it off, it's the fighting game community.